Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I do come from Spencer, North Carolina. Although it's not where I live, it's technically a second home on the account I'm there most of the days of the week. But I've been there for about 11 years now, roughly half of my life. I'm about 22 years old now, and I started when I was 11, so the math is pretty close to that. But I can credit that to loving trains with my great-grandfather. My grandfather, who's back there in the white shirt, him and Grandma took me out rail fanning quite a bit. And if you don't know what rail fanning is, it's when you go sit on the side of the tracks and wait a long time for trains. And sometimes you see a lot, sometimes you don't. It just depends. But the bug bit me very early and very quickly, and again, it's a pleasure to be with you tonight. I'd like to start out with the history of Spencer Shops. It's located right halfway between Greensboro and Charlotte off of Interstate 85. If you head towards Charlotte and then zip up 85 toward Greensboro, you'll run to the signs, and it's off of exit 79. In 1896, the Southern Railway was formed from the Richmond and Danville Railroad and a few other companies, including the railroad out here in Saluda. Well, the first president of the railroad was Samuel Spencer. He was at one time a Civil War veteran, also the president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. J.P. Morgan knew his expertise and knew he was really good at building up railroads, as he did with the B&O. And so he hired Samuel Spencer to take on the Southern, which was a hodgepodge of mismatched railroads. Well, Spencer was all about standardizing things and wanted everything across the board the same. And part of this was restoration and repair facilities. And so he wanted to build a facility that was exactly halfway between the two terminuses of the Southern Railway, which was Washington, D.C. and Atlanta, Georgia. So he acquired 144 acres of land, which was right north of Salisbury, North Carolina, just south of the Yadkin River where it crosses there. And that eventually became the shop facility that you see here. But yes, heavy repair and overhaul was done at Spencer's Shops. This included a 200-yard-long back shop, which was constructed in 1905. At the time of its completion, it was the largest industrial building in the state of North Carolina. Also, in 1924, a 37-stall roundhouse was constructed that replaced a 15-stall building in 1896. Those two buildings were the main place of maintenance and repair, though there are many other buildings across the shops. They not only did heavy repair, but they also did rebuilding of locomotives, this one being one. This is Southern Railway 1380. It was a 462 Pacific locomotive that was built, I believe, in 1926. It was one of the locomotives that pulled the Crescent Limited passenger trains. It was a very well-known passenger train from New York to New Orleans. And so in 1941, they took this engine in the shop and they redesigned it into a streamlined look, kind of similar to 611. This was done 9 years before 611, but they were doing streamlined jobs in Roanoke at the same time that this one was completed. But anyway, Otto Kohler was the one that designed the locomotive. Spencer Shops did the rebuild. And for about 9 years, it pulled the Tennessean, which was a train the Southern took from Washington, D.C. all the way down to Memphis, Tennessee. And part of that was actually on the Norfolk Western. So there may have been at one point where this engine could have handed off one of those trains to 611 or another Norfolk Western engine of similar design. But there was one problem with Spencer Shops. It was all steam. That was the pinnacle of transportation for railroads at the time. However, locomotives were growing old. Southern was very notorious for rebuilding locomotives. The last locomotive they ordered were in the late 1920s, and so the locomotives were starting to show their age within a couple of decades. Well, by the late 1930s, the electromotive division of General Motors started coming out with diesel engines, such as this FT locomotive. And the locomotives could travel much further, much faster, and much more efficient than the steam locomotives could. And the Southern saw this and they got a demonstrator set, which this is the demonstrator set after it was painted into Southern Railway. It went all around the country and tested out and compared to the steam locomotives. And after they saw how good the diesels were against the steam, they not only bought this demonstrator set, but they slowly replaced the steam locomotives all across the Southern with these newer diesel engines. A funny story at Spencer was in 1941, when the demonstrator set first arrived onto the property at Spencer Shops, the workers, out of spite, brought up old Switcher's steam locomotive and towed it in. They did. They didn't like the steam or the diesel locomotives. Steam was their passion. That was what they did. That was what made them unique and special. And there was one of the conductors went on record as saying that they wish they had lined up all the diesel locomotives and ran them off into the Yadkin River. They didn't like the They didn't like the diesels. By 1952, most of the steam engines were phased out. In 1953, the Southern became the first railroad in the entire United States to completely dieselize. Southern tried to work with diesel locomotives at Spencer shops. There were a couple buildings that were refurbished in order to do work on diesel locomotives. For example, one of the flue shops, which are flues for small cylindrical tubes in the steam locomotives, that was refurbished and repurposed into being an electrical shop for electrical parts of diesels. But a steam facility wasn't compatible with all diesel railroad, and by 1960 the shop facility was completely shut down. In fact, everything but the roundhouse, the railroad yard, which was 15 classification tracks, and the car repair shed was completely shut down and was forgotten about. Weeds were starting to grow up. People were thinking they were going to tear down the facility and sell it off to a developer. But that didn't happen. In 1977, Southern deeded 4 acres of land to the state of North Carolina for a transportation museum. A lot of those 4 acres were where the original buildings were that weren't being used. By 1979, they built a brand new railroad yard across the river in Linwood, and they donated the remaining, I think 53 acres, making 57 total, to the state of North Carolina for that same purpose. And we have all 57 acres today, and we've become the North Carolina Transportation Museum. And we've been dedicated to preserving the history of transportation across the state of North Carolina. Not only locomotives and railroad artifacts, but also automobiles, such as our 1935 Ford Highway Patrol car, which, by the way, still operates clear as a song. It's very difficult to drive, though. We have airplanes. We have a Piedmont Airlines DC-3 airplane. We have trucks. We have fire trucks. We have scooters. We have speeders. And we also have a couple boats. We can't use them, but this is a picture of our train ride here. This is our Norfolk Western Gp 9620 that was built in 1958. It is one of our most used locomotives on the property. That's a Norfolk Western combine car. Half of it was used for baggage and half of it was used for passenger service. We have retrofitted that to being an ADA accessible car. So if you were in a wheelchair or know anybody that's in a wheelchair, they can ride that train. They can hop on and enjoy the experience too. Thanks to the state of North Carolina helping us, the museum is completely ADA accessible for people to visit. So we're very glad to have that opportunity. Speaking of which, we also have a project with this thing. This is why I threw that picture here. It's a much newer locomotive that was used for Amtrak's passenger service across the United States. It may actually run on the train ride one day. We're crossing our fingers. This is our Barber Junction depot. This is a depot that was built in 1898 in the beautiful community of Barber, North Carolina, about 12 miles west of Salisbury. It's just like walking back in time, where you can walk in the station, you can grab a ticket, you can hop out on the platform and climb the train and ride on it. And that's the experience that we've really tried to replicate here at Spencer. If you look right there, that is our little birthday caboose. If you call ahead, you can hop on the train, you can have your birthday party. It goes on the train around the property. It's a really fun experience for those of you that have little ones, or for all ages. I was a brakeman one day and we had somebody who was 85 years old celebrating their birthday on the caboose. So it works out good. This is an Atlantic Coastline locomotive that was used on the Champion service between Richmond and Miami, Florida, with the help of the Florida East Coast Railroad. This is a locomotive that was used commonly in North Carolina. The Atlantic Coastline was actually one of the only railroad companies in existence to have their headquarters in the state of North Carolina. They had it in Wilmington until the merger with the Seaboard Airline. Behind it is a Atlantic Coastline Diner that we have at the property quite often. This is a locomotive that is currently owned by the Department of Cultural Resources that runs the museum. That's the state entity that does that. And it runs around the property every now and then, but unfortunately due to some regulations it cannot pull revenue service. But it sometimes runs around the property. If you're lucky, you can see it in operation. But more than likely it's in the roundhouse, and it's our oldest diesel locomotive. This thing was built in 1939. There were steam engines built after this locomotive. One of my favorite pieces, and one of the pristine pieces in our collection, is Southern Railway number 542. This is the quintessential Southern Railway steam locomotive. It was built in 1903 for the Southern Railway, primarily the Atlantic and Yankton subsidiary between Greensboro and Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The locomotive was retired at Spencer shops in 1953. It was one of the last steam locomotives to operate on the Southern. out of Spencer shops. After it was retired, it was placed on display in Tanglewood Park in Clemens, North Carolina until 1991 when we got it back. It is right now in the roundhouse, and it's able to be seen right when you walk into the building, which is really cool. By the way, after the Southern retired steam locomotives in the 1950s, they donated most of their bells and whistles and other things to different places. Most of the bells went to churches or towns that were able to be used. In fact, my church in Woodleaf, North Carolina has one of those bells. I believe y'all have one of those bells. The whistles were many times donated to factories or other railroads that needed them, and that disposition was very unique. The Southern Railway was one of many railroads that did that after they retired steam locomotives, but they did it widespread across there, and they donated it to communities that they originally served. One thing to know about Spencer is we are almost all volunteers. This is a picture of a few of our shop volunteers wiping down and cleaning our Southern Railway bay window caboose, which has been restored about a couple of years ago. Also in this picture is our yard office, which we also restored in the last couple of years. And if you look at the bay window caboose, it's a really good example of what the Southern used back in the day. A great example of 60s and 70s railroading, not only in Spencer, but also up here. Many of these were on the tail end of freight trains coming through this town about 40 or 50 years ago. And so they, like I said, they do dedicate a lot of time and talents to keep the place running. They're on train crew, they're in the shops, they work on the airplanes, they work on the automobiles. They do a lot of work, and most of the volunteers actually come out during special events too and make sure the events are a success. This is Southern Railway coach number 1081. It was built in 1922, though we're still trying to figure out the exact build date. It could have been operated in Spencer, it could have operated in Chattanooga, Saluda, anywhere that the Southern Railway needed it. And it was in regular service until it was used on the Southern Railway Steam Excursion Program in the 1970s. It was behind 4501, eventually 611, 722, 750, you name it. It and sister 1086 was donated to the Belfast and Moosehead Lake Railroad in Maine. And we somehow found them and brought them back down south. We restored 1081. 1086 is in the plans. Hopefully we can get that restored within the next little while. But 1081 is actually now on our train ride. We use it day in and day out. And if you ride the train, you will probably be able to ride in that car if you ask the conductor nicely. 630 is another Southern Railways locomotive that was built in 1904, I believe, 1903, 1904, somewhere around there. And it operated on the Asheville division. It could have ran Saluda, it could have ran anywhere from Asheville to Knoxville to Salisbury, and it was actively overhauled and repaired at Spencer, North Carolina. It is based out of Chattanooga, Tennessee now at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, which is on the other side of the mountains in Tennessee. And I guess we did such a good job that we got to take care of another steam locomotive. This one's a celebrity. This is Norfolk Western 611. It's a J-class locomotive built in 1950. This is the pinnacle of steam technology. This is a locomotive that was built in Roanoke, Virginia by the Norfolk Western Railroad. It was a very frequent visitor to many areas, including this hill here a couple times. It was brought out of retirement in 2014. It was brought down to Spencer shops because right now we're currently one of the only places in the southeast that have the capability of restoring a steam locomotive. We brought it into our shops, and within a year it was operational. This is one of the most popular steam locomotives we've ever had visit the museum. Brings in a lot of people. In fact, we had a whole family from Japan come out here. They knew about Spencer because of 611, and so it's really a big draw for us. Another famous engine is the Texas. Has anybody ever heard of the Great Locomotive Chase in 1862? Civil War rail fans, okay, like me, know that the Texas was one of the hero engines during the Great Locomotive Chase after, I believe, Colonel Andrews, I believe his name was, took it upon himself and a couple other people from the north to steal the general in Big Shanty, Georgia, which was eventually, I think, renamed to Kennesaw. And they decided to tear up the track between there and Chattanooga with that locomotive. Well, after chasing on foot, handcar, and a couple horses, the crew from the general that it was stolen from found this locomotive on a train that was going south while the general was going north. They took it off the train and ran it backwards to chase down. They did, to chase down the general. And they eventually was able to do it once the general started developing mechanical problems. Well, the Texas was considered to be a fairly well-known engine. It was eventually donated to the city of Atlanta and placed in a basement for the museum there. Well, it was brought out of there a couple of years ago and brought to Spencer with the purpose of being restored to an 1880s appearance. Now, people will probably say, well, it needs to be restored to the Civil War appearance, but this locomotive has been rebuilt 3 or 4 times after its service for the Western Atlantic Railroad during the Civil War. And it more resembles an 1880s appearance, and that's what it was restored in. It is in Atlanta at the History Center there. They're building a big old case outside of it so that you can actually see it when you're pulling up to the museum and can actually walk in and see the locomotive. A couple of good friends of mine were in charge of the restoration at Spencer Shops. I think they did a great job. This locomotive was here for about a year and a half, and we had an event involving it, a little tank engine that came from Indiana, and 611, 100 years of steam anniversary. It was a really cool event because this locomotive was built in 1856, 611 1950, and so you have 100 years of steam that can be celebrated there, and we sure did. It was a very fun event. So between 1896 and right about 1920, there was really an eclectic form of power because, like I mentioned earlier, the Southern Railway inherited a mess. The Richmond and Danville and 100 or so other companies across the Southeast were really short lines, and they had different power. So Samuel Spencer, the first people for the Southern Railway, had to combine these locomotives and use them in various times. A lot of these look like this. Many times there were 440s, 460s, 442s after the Civil War up until the turn of the century. If you see this locomotive here, it's called the white configuration, and it depends on how many wheels are under the locomotive at a certain spot. So you have 4 wheels here, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that would be 4. Then you have a dash between the front, they call those the pilot trucks. Then the drivers, which are in the middle here, you have 2, 4, 6, and I'm counting both wheels. So that's 4, 6. And then you have none at the back here. So that will be a 0. So the 442 you were asking about would have been 4, 4, and then 2 in the back. So that's the white configuration of locomotives. And that's why if I throw out numbers like 280s, 482s, that's that configuration. So, and you'll see that in a lot of pictures. And so these locomotives were used well up into the 1930s. For example, this locomotive is Southern Railway 1102. It was built, I believe, originally for the Richmond and Danville, and operated on the Southern Railway as a 460. It was most famously referred to as the Old 97 when it fell into the Stillhouse Trestle Creek in 1903, en route to Spencer, actually, pulling the fast mail train, which was numbered 97 at the time. After it was pulled out, it was rebuilt at Spencer Shops completely and placed back into service. Not many people know that. Operated until the late 1930s. I believe it was involved in about 5 or 6 other accidents after that. They called it the curse engine for a reason. Okay, so the consolidations of my personal favorite kind of locomotives, these are the 280s. So they have 8 in the middle, 2 in the front, and 0 in the back. And so these were locomotives that were used as workhorses. They were the ones that did the yard power, the switching, different things like that in and around the railroad. They hauled the shorter local trains, the Murphy branch. These were on the Murphy branch all the time between Asheville and Murphy. They would have occasionally been here, though they may have been pulling 2 locomotives on trains. It just depends on what was needed at the time. Many of these locomotives around here were assigned to the Asheville division. For example, 630, which is this locomotive here, I showed it to you earlier. It was assigned to the Asheville division along with Southern 722, which is preserved at the museum in Dillsboro, the Great Smoky Mountains Railroad. Those are 2 Asheville engines that are still around that may or may not have actually traversed Saluda Grade during the time. Another one that may or may not have been used in helper service is the 282 Mikados. I believe I have my information right, that was named after an emperor of Japan, hence the unique name. But it has 2 wheels in the front, 8 in the middle, 2 in the back. And these locomotives were used for anywhere from heavy freights to light freights, depending if it was a light Mikado or a heavy Mikado. Many of the heavy Mikados, or many of the Mikados on here on the Saluda line were heavy Mikados. Many of those were classified as MS4 locomotives. And they were the big hosses like these right here. A lot of them actually had feed water heaters up here at the top. 4501 is the last of these locomotives. It's at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. The other form of helper locomotives, in fact the most common I've ever seen in pictures, is the 210-2 Santa Fe class. These were the biggest, or second biggest freight locomotives on the Southern Railway. They were the biggest common locomotives on the Southern Railway. They had 2 wheels in the front, 10 in the middle, and then 0 in the back, or 2 in the back, I'm sorry. They were very, very strong locomotives, and they were used constantly not only in helper service. Sometimes they would be leading a freight train. Sometimes they would actually haul freight trains out of Spencer in order to get to Asheville. And a lot of times that's how they got back to Saluda, was they would haul trains out of Spencer. And so, again, different locomotives varied about where they were needed. And so wherever the Southern needed to pull freight, they would go. It just depends on where they were assigned to. The biggest locomotive that Southern Railway used was the 2882. They called these the Malays, or Mallet, however you want to call it, or the LS class is what we call them for the Southern Railway specifically. They had 2 wheels in the front, 8 here, then there's more, 8 more, another set of drivers, and then 2. They call these articulated, and so they had them separated. So they had different sets of drivers, so allowed them to go around the curve. If you had all 16 wheels together, you couldn't go around any curve. And so allowed for the locomotive to actually bend a little bit better going around curves. Yes, and that's why they were used commonly out here too, because they were not only strong enough to go up the hill, but they were also versatile enough to be able to go up too. And so these were constantly used as well. A lot of these were sometimes in Alabama, sometimes in Knoxville, sometimes in Saluda. They varied based off of where they were needed. These, I don't believe, were used very commonly on Saluda Grade because they simply weren't designed to pull the trains here at Saluda. They weren't really mountain locomotives. Like I said earlier, they were used for more flat lands. And so, especially the smaller 462s were deregulated to smaller short line passenger trains at different places across the system. My personal favorite locomotives that Southern had were the 482 Mountains. These were, I would say, the dream locomotive. They were not only strong, and they were not only versatile, but they could also pull passenger trains and look good too. The Southern Railway painted a lot of these green and gold, just like the 462 Pacifics. And you can tell here, this is actually taken outside the Asheville Roundhouse here. Potentially could have gone to Knoxville, Spencer, Saluda, whichever one. And they were designed for the mountain passenger trains. They were actually called the mountain locomotive because of this purpose, because they were designed to pull up hills. And so this picture here is one of these 482 Mountains actually going through Saluda. The place I actually had dinner tonight, the restaurant there at the corner, that is exactly where it's at, coming up the hill. And so if you look at the scene back here, that's the helper. Not only on freight trains, but the helper was also used on passenger trains to get up the mountain. And so you would have a locomotive sitting at the bottom of the mountain, push it up, they would go back and wait for the next train. They didn't discriminate between freight and passenger. Locomotive and train that needed to get up the mountain, they used a helper every single time they needed it. But this is the GP7, GP9s, GP18s. These were called Jeeps, and G-E-E-P-S. And they were called that because of the notification for it, which was GP, which stands for general purpose. And that's exactly what these locomotives were used. General purpose around the rail yard. They were used for switching operations. They were used for mainline trains early on. And they were just about as good as steam locomotives were. This is one of the GP7s, I believe, and one of the GP9s. I think I may have got that backwards. They were almost identical in design. You also have the GP30. The GP30 comes along in the early 1960s. They're much more powerful. They have turbochargers. They're much bigger and they're much better. And these engines were not only used on short line operations, but they were also used on the main line well up until the 1980s. They were used all the time here in Saluda. 2601 is actually preserved at Spencer. You can actually see it on the train ride if you go on the certain month that it's pulling. You can definitely see it at the museum. Ours was built in 1963, and we do have photo evidence that it ran on the Murphy branch between Asheville and Murphy. After that, the GP35 comes out. Doesn't have the hump like the GP30 did, but it was a little bit better than the GP30. These came out right after the 30s did in the mid-1960s. Then they come out with the GP38s. They're even bigger, they're even stronger. And the reason they were used for short line operations is because they only had 4 axles, 1, 2, 3, 4. They were very versatile to get into industries and be able to pull cars out of different places and put them on trains. Okay, so the GP50 is the pinnacle of the 4-axle locomotives for Southern. These locomotives were used constantly on this line from pictures and evidence. Some of you guys may remember these locomotives on the line if you were here. So we're going to talk about the 6-axle power very briefly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. These were the 6 axles. And these locomotives, in comparison with the GP class, they were not as agile in being able to get into industries and stuff. And so they were mainly used on road freights from point A to point B. So then the SC35 comes out. This is one of EMD's greatest hits in my opinion. They were one of the most versatile 6-axle locomotives of all time. They were very similar to the GP35 in design that I showed you earlier, and these were quite frequently used well up into the late 1970s. Many of them did develop some problems later on. The SD40, the SD42, and the SD45s are the most common, in my opinion, type of locomotives that were on this line here. They were very unique on the fact they had 6 axles, they could generate more traction, and they were able to pull more. Now given, they weren't as strong as today's locomotives, and especially the ones that pulled later on during the Norfolk Southern years, but they definitely did have a lot of oomph when they were pulling trains. In the training video that you can find on YouTube of this old Southern Railway, SD40-2s, SD45s, and SD40s were most of the locomotives in that video. And they did that because they were so good with not only dynamic braking, but they were also good to be able to pull freight up and down the Saluda Grade. Then we get into the General Electric locomotives. By the way, everything before that was the electromotor division of General Motors. And so that was my personal favorite builder, and I'm biased toward them based off, and Southern liked them too. Most of their stuff was EMD products. But they had a few General Electric locomotives, like the U-23B, which was 4 axles. They called them U-boats because U, which was utility, I believe. And the U-23B was used in local service, just like the GP30s, GP35s, GP38s. The B30-7As were used on road freight, switching service. Most of the time you will see these on road freights and videos and pictures. They were another one of General Electric's purposes. The U-33C was like these, but they were 6 axles, so they mainly stayed on the main line. They didn't have too many of those. And then you had the B23-7, which is, and you can tell General Electric locomotives almost look the same across the board. You just have to know the numbers to tell them apart. The B23s were 4 axles, so they could actually get in the industry some switching service. So finally, for the covered wagons, my favorite ones. These are the rounded ones that people best identify. The FTs were the locomotives that basically replaced these steam locomotives, just like the GP7s were. These came out starting in '39, like the demonstrator set, which was an FT A and B set. I believe the mid-40s was when the FTs started cutting off. And they were very versatile. They were very strong and powerful. In fact, there's a set that's still around today, Southern 6100, that is at the Museum of Transportation in St. Louis. The F3s were the intermediates between the FTs and the F7s. Not many of these were used by the Southern, but they were a good transition locomotive between the two. Then you get to the F7s and the FP7s. These are the most popular locomotives that people remember for the Southern Railway and for most railroads in general. You know, most people think when you think of train, they'll pop into their head AT and SF, Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe F7, the silver and red one. Okay, that's what most people think of. That's the FP7 or F7. Most of your starter trains, model trains, are F7 kits. And so the only difference is, you notice the F7 and the FP7 have different names. Well, the F7 was really only designed to pull freight. Well, the FP7 was not only designed to pull freight, but it was also designed to pull passenger, because many of them had steam generators inside. They could take care of the passenger cars on the train. Now, 6133, the locomotive pictured here, is preserved at the Transportation Museum today. It is actually in the rotation right now for the train ride. The Carolina Special almost always had F units on it. 6133 and other FP7s were used constantly on the Carolina Special here. In fact, the last Carolina Special had a pair of them pulling through here. There was a good article in that about the SRHA. So the E units were a little bit longer than the F7s, and they also not only had one prime mover, which is basically a big engine, but they had 2 of them in there. They were built to be stronger and could haul long distance trains. E6s, E7s, E8s were locomotives used by the Southern, and many of those also pulled the Carolina Special through here. There's a lot of pictures of them out and about pulling those different trains. They also pulled the Crescent Limited well into 1979 before they gave the service over to Amtrak. But guys, I want to take the time to thank you. I appreciate it.